Welcome to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. My name is Shruti Vadat and I will be sharing today's session. Our first presenter for today is Soriya. Please start when you are ready.
Okay. So can everyone see my poster okay? Awesome. Okay. So to start off with, I wanted to ask a question. Did you ever think of the impact of the death penalty on those who experience it? Not just on the accused, but on those who enforce it or on the families of those impacted by it? Well, my name's Georgia and I am a fourth year student at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and I am doing a Bachelor of Education. I'm presenting with three of my colleagues, Stefanie, Soriya, and Callum, who all participated in a seminar with me where we interrogated this new methodology called the History of Experience and grappled with its complexity. Our poster presentations are the outcome of that work. My research question is, to what extent does the History of Experience methodology offer new perspectives on the experience of the death penalty in the United States of America, with specific reference to Andrea Lyons' book, The Death Penalty, What's Keeping It Alive? And my presentation will present a small element of my broader findings. So what is the Hex methodology to begin with? So taking it straight from Rob Bottas and Mark Smith's research in emotion, sense, and experience, the History of Experience uses a flexible concept of experience that permits analysis of all elements of lived reality. So the Hex methodology proposes a biocultural model of world, brain, and body, explaining that they are entwined in a dynamic cause and effect that helps to explain the historicity of language and the human. So if we look at world, this is the exploration of varied and dynamic structures, including knowledge and discourse, in which humans act, engage, and are acted upon. Brain is the consideration of how individuals and groups process this knowledge and interpret or understand the world. And then body is the examination of how perceptions and understandings of the world are embodied, enacted, and remembered. While I have separated these on my poster, you should look at these components as interrelated and entangled, looking at the experiences of those in a whole sense. Experience is situational, unstable, relational, and dynamic. Andrea Lyons, the author of the book I have used as a case study, was the first woman to serve as lead attorney in a death penalty case, a case I will delve into. She holds a strong anti-death penalty stance and highlights the socioeconomic and racial prejudice ingrained in the system. I chose to use Andrea Lyons' book as my examination of the History of Experience methodology would be best displayed when compared to Lyons' Quantitative and Qualitative Analysis. This quote encapsulates the book's message. They, the public, don't know their life stories, what circumstances drove them to be where they were and now are, and can't see their humanity until it's placed before them in a sentencing hearing. Now, throughout the book, Lyons refers to statistics to invalidate arguments made about the death penalty's effectiveness as a deterrent of crime. That is, she uses quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis is the examination and interpretation of numerical data and statistics. Some examples from her book include that it costs California $308 million per execution, $90,000 more than sentencing someone to life in prison. And out of 5,760 death sentences between 1973 and 1995, 4,578 of them were reviewed on appeal, and 1,885 of these were thrown out on serious error. Now, although this highlights the numbers involved, it essentially homogenizes the experience, ultimately detaching the humans that are involved, dehumanizing a very human practice. Moving a little closer to analyzing experience, Lyons uses a qualitative analysis in her book also. This is the examination and interpretation of non-numerical data like documents and media reports. By using a qualitative method of analysis, where Lyons' data is collected and interpreted to understand conceptual ideas, key groups involved in the death penalty are exposed, and a nuanced interpretation is attempted. For example, in her book, she categorizes people under certain broad characteristics like Black jurors and white victims, inadvertently assigning the experiences of one person to those in a group with an imagined set of corresponding characteristics. Ultimately, this approach ignores individual experience, assuming all have the same experience with the death penalty. By categorizing people into homogenous groups, it does not ultimately allow for the diverse and nuanced emotions, feelings, perception, and memories of those impacted by the practice to be highlighted or studied effectively, forgetting the human beings that are involved. To reiterate, the history of experience methodology looks at the ever-changing and dynamic relationships between individuals and the context they live in, or the event they experience, in this case, the death penalty. In order to illustrate this, I'm going to analyze one of Lyons' clients, Madison Hobley, an African-American man who was charged with 7 counts of murder as a result of arson and sentenced to death for his crime. He was tortured by police into allegedly confessing to setting the fire in which his wife and infant son were killed. He was exonerated in 2003 due to violations of his constitutional rights and false evidence. He did receive $6.5 million in compensation, but doesn't really rectify the experience that he had with his interrogation and subsequent 13 years in prison. With the world brain body framework, the injustice in the situated context of Madison Hobley's case is clear. Whether or not he was guilty of the act for which he was subsequently exonerated for, he did not receive fair treatment by any means. In the world component, the judicial and law enforcement authorities favor cases being closed quickly, placing a relative importance on the police involved while also being situated in an entrenched discourse of racism in American society. The judicial system's desire for justice, or finding convenient scapegoats as to seem in control, the power, mainly white and male, and racism embedded in the system all lead to a dominance of negative attitudes towards race and class, and thus to individuals like Hobley. If we look at the brain component, how world is perceived, Hobley and many other Black defendants are seen as guilty until proven innocent. The death penalty being used to control certain races and behaviors, ultimately illustrating that Black lives are less valued and police actors are considered more authoritative. Now, at the body component, how it is embodied. Madison Hobley endured acts of torture and blame by police officers like Detective Dwyer, with lying, withholding evidence, planting evidence, ignoring leads, and altering evidence to create a good result. Hobley also endured a torture technique called bagging, where they placed a plastic typewriter bag over his head until he lost consciousness and repeated this until he confessed. The police were also not held accountable until Hobley's appeal, 13 years later. Racial and socioeconomic prejudices were also apparent in the fact that the officers' testimonies outweighed the significance of Hobley's own. In summary, the accused became a victim of the system. With the Hex lens, we can interrogate the injustice embedded in the death penalty system by interrogating the societal structures that hold it aloft and how these are perceived by individuals and groups, and how these impact on lived lives and experiences on a variety of individuals. In this example, using Hex's biocultural model, I focus on the structures highlighted in Lyons' book, specifically the US law enforcement's dominant mentalities and racial prejudices generally, how these were perceived by the authorities, that is, ingrained beliefs in superiority of certain classes and races over others, and ultimately impacted the lived reality of those presumed to be authorities, police and the courts, and those presumed to be criminals, Madison Hobley. Ultimately reversing the key assumption that the death penalty is a practice in search of justice, exposing its embedded injustices. To conclude, I'd like to thank my fellow researchers, Soriya, Stefanie, and Callum, who you will all hear from in this presentation, for their support, as well as Dr. Karen McCluskey, the key figure behind my undertaking this study, mentoring me through this process and continuing it through to this amazing opportunity hosted by ACUR. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Georgia, for that insightful presentation. So we can now open up the Q&A. I'd like to ask our judges if they have any questions. for Georgia. Our attendees in the meanwhile can also post their questions to the Q&A, or they can raise their hand and I'll unmute them. Okay, no questions? Sally hasn't. Go ahead.
So through your use of the Hex methodology, did you find that it was a useful framework for answering the question that you asked? And did you have a chance to compare or contrast it to any other existing frameworks?
Yes, I did find it very useful. I find that when I have a conversation about someone, about their opinion on the death penalty, it's a lot talking about maybe the costs that are involved, or these really broad concepts that we can't really find tangible. But by using Hex, I was able to actually put a face to the experience and put a face to what the death penalty actually impacts people, because we don't have it here in Australia. So it's something really interesting for me to look into. And comparing it to another framework, the main two that I focused on was Lyons's use of the two, quantitative and qualitative. I found that comparing something that focused on experience a lot more than statistics and sort of broad groups did help clarify how the death penalty does really impact those that are involved.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question from the audience for you, Georgia. What other experiences could be examined using Hex?
I think, as you'll see with Callum, Steph's and Soriya's presentations, I think that there are a lot of experiences and a lot of events and a lot of people that can be sort of studied with Hex in an education sort of context, like my presenters will show. It's really interesting way of looking into the history we already teach and modern history. And Stefanie will go into also how it looks into ancient history as well, which is something really exciting and interesting. And I think Hex can be applied to anyone because we all have a world we live in, we all have a brain that we perceive things with, and we all have a body that we perceive things and embody things with. So I think it's widely applicable.
Thank you for that. If there are no more questions, I think we can move on to the next presenter. So our next presenter for today is Stefanie. Whenever you're ready.
Is that okay for everybody? Yep, perfect. All right. Imagine being born into a world consumed by politics, war, and religion. Imagine reaching the age of 5 when a group of men come into your home and rip you away from the only life you have ever known. Suddenly, you are thrust into a world of secluded women and are now a possession of the state. You are now at the center of Roman society and all eyes are on you. You grow up groomed and coaxed to personify feminine virtue. You are told to not give in to natural human desires. Do not stray from your responsibilities. Pray to Vesta, keep the flame alight. You know that the city depends on you, but if you fail, you pay with your life. Although you are physically separated and isolated from Roman civilization, you are the piece that holds it all together. And if anything threatens to destroy the ecosystem of ancient Roman society, you are to blame. These girls and women were thrown into a life that they never had a say in, where their bodies and sexuality were the key components to saving the nation. Their mere existence, history, and experiences were lost throughout time, as male-dominated narratives became the topic of interest. These women were once at the forefront of ancient Rome, yet now their stories are hidden at the back of bookshelves and in between the lines of textbooks. Once some of the most prominent women within the ancient world have now become marginalized, with their experiences going unnoticed by many. So what is the history of experience methodology? And how does it help interrogate what it meant to be a woman at the center of the Roman Empire? Well, Hex is a coming-of-age historical methodology that explores history through the lived experience of the individual and group actors of the set period. There is a strong emphasis on using a biocultural model, world, brain, and body, in order to intricately break down the components that make up the historical moment. The world explores the contexts and structures. The brain considers how the event, persons, or beliefs are perceived within the given context. And then the body allows us to examine how these perceptions are embodied by the actors, whether that be physically, emotionally, or cognitively. The Hex methodology allows us to delve into the complexities of the lives of the priestess cult and try to grasp an understanding of how religion controlled the experiences of their life. It is important to understand that they were individuals. Even though they came as a unit, their experiences were not always collective, yet throughout history they are often grouped into one category and often analyzed under the lens of a modern feminine discourse. For example, that they were all exploited, that none of them wanted to do their jobs, or that their only responsibility was to look pretty and to preserve the temple of Vesta. There is often no room for individuality, and this notion is far from the truth. So to understand the effectiveness of the methodology, we can look at just one scenario and already begin to extrapolate a varying degree of responses and experiences from the Vestals. So if we apply this biocultural model to just one situation, we look at the trials of Vestals Opimia and Floronia. We begin to deconstruct the makeup of the event and gather information that may have otherwise gone unnoticed. So within the world, we can see that the Vestals already held a significant importance upon their implementation at the beginning of Rome's history. So Livy recounts that the appointment of the priestess cult was made by King Numa Pompilius, who preceded the founder Romulus. It is said that his appointment was made by the gods themselves, so often the decisions he made went uncontested and were heeded with deep respect. The king was known to be heavily versed in all laws of religion and politics, so it was a priority for him to create a state that reflected those priorities and his knowledge. Rome was also a young and new city, very much vulnerable to the surrounding states and wars that waged around them. The king sought to ensure that religion became a heavy focus and foundation for his governance, and one of his most notable decisions was the creation of the Vestal Virgin cult. They were now the beacon of hope that society was looking for. Then we begin to narrow down to the contextual environment of 215 BC, where this situation occurs. And Hannibal has rampaged through the city, leaving terror and destruction in his wake. This proved detrimental as the citizens were now living in fear, questioning their leaders, and questioning the legitimacy of the narrative of Rome's truly great beginning. Proceeding to the brain model and looking at the situational perceptions, it came down to two main ideas. One, that the Vestals were essential to the success of their empire, so their virginity and purity was inextricably connected to the well-being of the state. And two, as a consequence, if something went wrong, then they were at fault. Not only were they beacons of hope, but they were also essentially scapegoats. And then we come to the body, where we examine how these beliefs were embodied and lived out. Amongst the general society, the occurrence of a threat against Rome meant that the physical bodies of the Vestals may have been corrupted. So the only plausible solution was to remove the body from the city in order to restore the welfare of the state. For the Vestals, the embodiment of their beliefs meant doing their duties, and in instances of disaster, then undergoing a physical trial of ritual sacrifice. However, it is also essential to investigate their emotional reactions to further consolidate the essence of their experience. So looking at the responses of Vestals, Opimia, and Floronia, we see that one Vestal actually accepted her fate and was sacrificed, undergoing the process of being buried alive. It's evident that she lived out her religious duties until the very end of her life. However, the other Vestal is reported to have committed suicide. There is speculation on the reason as to why, whether it was from shame or the want to take matters into her own hands for a sense of control, or merely fear of the trial process. However, what we can ultimately take from this and immediately note is that their responses and reactions were drastically different. Despite that they both faced the same threat at the same time, living out the same duties within the same contextual environment, they clearly experienced and viewed their religious world under different lenses. This concept is then substantiated with handwritten extracts from Vestal's Cornelia and Amelia, where we see, although 204 years apart from one another, they also face the same fate of trial and sacrifice. Amelia voices devotion to her role and is seemingly accepting of her responsibility and the need to carry out her duties until the very end. However, the words of Cornelia bring about this tone of frustration. She's almost questioning the logic behind the process, since she knows that she has embodied the Roman beliefs throughout her entire life and has done everything that she is required to do, yet she now somehow faces death. Each of these women mentioned dedicated their lives to the well-being of their state. Each allocated the same duties and roles to play. Yet their emotional and physical reactions are indicative of the vast and varying experiences of their lives and relationship with the world. Therefore, the experiences of the Vestal Virgins cannot be confined to one overall collective experience. Although the women were seen as a unit within society, their personal lived religious experiences varied. The extensive external pressures and responsibilities affected the women in varying ways. Scholarship attempts to define their experience using a general discourse of femininity, when in fact each woman reacted in different ways. This has been thoroughly exemplified in only one scenario that used the Hex methodology. So to conclude, finally, I would like to send my regards and thanks to my fellow presenters, Georgia, Callum and Soriya, as well as our lecturer, Dr. Karen McCluskey, for their constant support and feedback. I would also like to leave you with this thought. Imagine what can be discovered, whether previously unnoticed or yet to be uncovered, when this is applied to a variety of events and periods all throughout history. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie, for that engaging presentation. I think we can open up our Q&A to our judges and our attendees. Any questions?
Hi there, I can ask a question. Thanks.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, Stefanie, how you chose ancient Rome, like why that was your decision to apply this hex to, and if this is something, I guess, because you guys are in education, is this something you plan on teaching to a group of students, and how this might affect your like lesson plans and objectives, I guess?
Yeah. Admittedly, ancient Rome was something I was always quite interested in, and I knew that it would probably be hard. Because I'm a secondary education student, I also major in religious education. So the concept of religion has always been very intriguing to me. But also I thought that I kind of, I guess, want to challenge myself a little bit because it's hard to, I guess, sometimes get an understanding of all the experiences, especially in the ancient world when there's very limited amount of resources. So I wanted to really try and see if we could understand what the religious life is like, because that's often very untouched just throughout history in general, I find. So that was something that I found really intriguing. And also ancient Rome is part of the syllabus, the secondary education syllabus. But I don't know if I would say there's a major focus on religion. So I thought that in hopes one day when I teach ancient Rome as well, that this is something I can bring in as like even if it's not part of the syllabus, but just like an extra component as a way of engaging the class and just, I guess, bringing the syllabus to life a little bit as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds really good. Yeah, that'll be really interesting for your future students.
And Any more questions from our judges or from our attendees? Okay, then I think Stefanie, that's it.
There's a question on the Q&A box.
Yeah, there's one comment. So yeah, you mentioned that it is difficult to find resources for lived religion. Is that a specific issue for ancient history or all experience history?
I would personally say I find that, at least in my experience, I can only answer based on my own experience. I find that it's particularly harder for ancient history just because not every, because it's ancient, a lot of the resources are much harder to find, but also a lot of the time the experience of religion in the actual people themselves isn't often kept. A lot of resources focus on more politics and the idea of kind of war and things like that. So it's much harder to, but I definitely don't dismiss the idea that it is hard throughout all of history. I'm sure that there are so many different religions that we don't know much about, let alone the people that were involved, because it can be difficult. But just from my experience, at least, I find that ancient is a little bit harder, but yeah.
Thank you. Yep, I think any more questions? We've answered all the questions. So yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Stephanie. We can move on to our next presenter. Soriya, you can start whenever you're ready.
Can you all see that okay? Is that all visible?
Yep, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay. Place yourselves back in your Year 10 history classroom. Visualize the room arrangement. Remember studying for your exam where you attempted to memorize all the facts you heard rather than spend time thinking about the experiences of the people you studied. Good afternoon. My name is Soriya Farah, and I'm a secondary education student at the University of Notre Dame, majoring in history. My colleagues, Georgia and Steph, have showcased how one can use the history of experience methodology to reveal ancient and modern experiences. Callum and I will present the same methodology, but put forth how one might use the methodology as a pedagogical tool. The current New South Wales history curriculum teaches senior students that the motives and actions of historical actors and groups have shaped our society. While the teaching strategies are effective, I propose that senior history teachers use the new methodology, the history of experience, as a pedagogical tool. This tool has the potential to offer students a more varied and accurate account of history based on how people perceived and experienced historical situations. Today, I will introduce the history of experience and then discuss a proposed case study of how Hex can be utilised in a senior history class looking at the White Australia policy. So let's begin with what is Hex. The history of experience is a modern historical methodology which, according to leading scholars in the field, Otis and Smith, captures the lived and meaningful reality of historical actors within a specific historic context. There are three components within the methodology: world, which explores the political and social structures of the time; brain, which investigates the thoughts and actions of the historical actors with that context; and the body, which uncovers the actions and feelings of the actors based on both. Our thoughts and feelings are a catalyst for not only our actions, but for how we view our experiences, which is pivotal to understanding how the past has shaped the present. So that leads to the important question: how does Hex create a more meaningful engagement? Senior history students currently analyse sources to reveal the lives of historical actors and groups. Most of these sources are biased towards the elite, particularly due to illiteracy of common people and a lack of knowledge regarding preservation. I believe that using Hex as a pedagogical tool within a senior history class will enable students to engage with the experiences of historical actors and groups more fully. If used as a historical investigation project, students may investigate the experiences of their ancestors or groups that have impacted their personal lives. We cannot reconstruct or relive the past, but we can attempt to engage with experiences and meaningfully shape our perceptions of the past, present, and future around them. Using the history of experience as a pedagogical tool is only a proposed concept. To model how a teacher may implement the methodology, I created a hypothetical Year 11 Modern History unit on the White Australia policy. Whilst my approach focuses predominantly on teaching the attitudes of the Chinese towards the certificate exempting the dictation test, known as a CEDT, I created a website as a resource which provides information on Hex, the White Australia policy, possible assessment tasks, and class activities. My interest in the White Australia policy arose when I discovered that my great-great-granddad was one of the first Chinese immigrants to be granted Australian citizenship and was exempt from immigration policies. The experiences of Jansi Chin would have been drastically different to other Chinese migrants, and Hex has enabled his personal journey to be revealed. I will showcase how one might use the history of experience framework of world, brain, and body to reveal the attitudes of the Chinese towards the CEDT. Let's begin with the world, looking at the political and social structure. In the 1800s, especially the 50s due to the gold rush, colonial Australia saw an increase in Chinese immigrants as they came to make a fortune for themselves and their families back home. By 1877, 17,000 Chinese resided in colonial Australia and collected 90% of earnings from the gold diggings. State leaders were threatened by this situation as they feared they would lose their dominant Western British identity. To maintain Australia's British identity, the Immigration Restriction Act, or White Australia Policy, was passed in 1901. The government strategically wrote the act to restrict non-white immigrants but omitted words relating to race. The act was scribed to fulfill not only the government's desires, but to maintain good relations with the imperial government, as Queen Victoria didn't approve of discrimination regarding race and culture. The dictation test was the main tool used to restrict immigration between 1901 and 1958. All migrants sat the test, which involved an officer reciting a 50-word paragraph once. To pass, the migrant needed to scribe the paragraph with no grammatical or spelling errors, including no missed or extra words. The passage was recited in English between 1901 and 1904 to reflect the country's British identity. The government became worried when 46 of 805 applicants passed the test between 1902 and 1903, and as a result, in 1905, the government decided that the officer could choose any language to complete the test, for example, Gaelic, if they suspected the migrant could speak English. From 1909, the test was a success as no one passed the test. Despite the Tough Restriction Act, non-Europeans could be granted a certificate exempting the dictation test if they had resided in Australia for 5 years and their local leaders considered them to be of good character. Eurasians were the most successful in receiving the certificate as it was believed that they would live by their European culture more than their Asian while in Australia. The certificate enabled them to travel to China and return without taking part in the dictation test, provided they returned before the certificate's expiry. This gave them some freedom. However, it is only through understanding their thoughts and feelings that we can uncover their true opinions about the test. The brain, which looks at the thoughts. The Chinese migrated to colonial Australia to improve their livelihoods. However, their beliefs and attitudes reflected their origin culture. Contrary to popular belief, many Chinese considered themselves as Australians and wanted to engage with both their Chinese and Australian identity, despite the society being divided on their opinions regarding immigration. Many Chinese migrants spent their weekends engaging in Chinese culture and studying Australian culture, such as learning about Christianity and Western furniture styles. Despite their efforts to assimilate in society, immigration policy served as a constant reminder of their exclusion. Most of the Chinese who had arrived in a colonial Australia came alone or in small groups and made multiple trips a year to see their families. The new policies ensured that they worked tirelessly for hours on each day to provide for their families, which they were prevented from seeing. There was also the understanding that it will be impossible for their families to pass the dictation test and be extremely difficult to receive a CEDT. Finally, let's look at the body. The poster shows the CEDT of Jan Chin, which displays his identity, travel plans, and appearance details. Whilst this seems like a basic travel document, the photo displays Chin in his European clothing. This represents his wealth and prominence in his local town. His wife, who was also Eurasian, and their 13 children received CEDTs and were photographed as well in European clothing, a strategic choice to demonstrate the government's officials as they assimilated into Australian culture. This and his great success in running a sugarcane farm in Queensland led to his acceptance as a colonial Australian citizen, a rarity for a Chinese. The Australian government required a left handprint on the back of one CEDT. This was a safety feature to control migration. Whilst it doesn't seem significant, the surrender of the left handprint in China, which was reserved for criminals, which led to Chinese believing this was an insult. They felt like prisoners, inferior to the government. Chin sought to be exempted from the handprint condition, no doubt with a sigh of relief when he and his wife were ultimately spared from it, with the support of the local government area, a testament to his standing in his community and his agency in directing his own destiny. To summate, although it's still a proposal, even this small snippet here shows that Hex has the potential to meaningfully engage students with the past. By researching the wide Australia policy through a Hex lens, I revealed something more simply than the facts of the policy. Instead, I showed how the policy impacted the experiences of the Chinese during the time, specifically in relation to Jan Chin. The study clarified the dominant prejudicial structures and how at least one individual managed to negotiate them. In this way, Hex helps to undermine established historical narratives which tend to homogenize experience. Meaningfully, as a Eurasian living in Australia and a descendant of Jan Chin, I understand how the past influenced my place in the world. By using Hex as a pedagogical tool, students will be able to embark on a personal journey, like myself, to reveal how experiences have shaped their existence and meaningfully engage with history. I would like to thank my peers and Dr. Callum McKenzie for all their support through this project, and for Pamela Wong for inspiring me to research the experiences of Jan Chin.
Thank you, Soriya. That was a really interesting presentation. We can open up our Q&A to our judges and attendees. Any questions for Soriya?
Soriya, great talk. I was wondering what you would see your next steps as being in terms of validating this approach as a tool for teaching, and how you might then communicate those results to other teachers if it was successful.
Okay, perfect. So I think that the first thing to address is I would love to approach this still with the Wide Australia policy, and the website that I had on my poster actually has pretty much a whole bunch of lesson activities as to how I would carry it out. I think that the next process for me would be to teach a history class through the methodology and see if we can compare it between teaching it without the methodology compared to with the methodology, and then see if we can have, say, like a difference in results. Personally, I think that the content that students will learn will be the same. It's just a matter of what approach that they may take. They may decide to look at the policy being strict government policy to only restrict Asian immigration, and they may think of it as how a lot of people do these days, how the Chinese tried to take over, whereas the history of experience would enable them to either look at not only that approach of the society who didn't appreciate immigration, but enables them to also look at how the British monarchy viewed immigration, as well as the government and the Chinese. So I think it definitely does need to carry out in a classroom, and then compare it, maybe teaching it without the methodology compared to with. But yes, that's how I would go about it.
Great, thank you.
There's a question for you from the audience, Soriya. Would it be your intention that students find their own personal sources to explore, or would it be more effective to set a standard source for them to analyze collectively?
I think all the presenters here can vouch that finding sources on your own can be quite difficult, especially when you're starting out. So I think that especially when you study senior history, you do get something like a historic project where you research whatever topic you like. However, I do think that as teachers, if we were to carry this out, we would provide maybe either some sources to begin with, or at least give them a foundation of these are the types of written sources you might be looking for, or this might be helpful for your research, or try to steer away from these things if you're trying to look at this approach. Obviously, they would be more than welcome to find their own sources, and that would be encouraged as a form of extension. However, it won't be a throw you in the deep end and see whatever you find. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Any more questions for Soriya? I think that's it. Thank you so much. So yeah, our final presenter for today is Callum. Callum, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Can we all see that there today, guys?
Yep,
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Callum McKenzie, a secondary education student at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. The past few presentations, we've heard about the history of experience, or Hex methodology, and how Georgia, Stefanie, and Soriya have all used this methodology to understand the past critically and holistically in their own projects. The proposed study that I will guide you through today focuses on the implementation of this brand new methodology to engage secondary school students in the classroom in the subject of history, as well as allowing for a greater understanding of the past. In this new world through COVID-19, the need for teachers to engage students is becoming more of a necessity. Even before online learning, recent scholarship found that student engagement fell on average by 25% within 2 years of starting high school. If we follow this trend, in a Year 10 classroom, over 1/3 of students are disengaged. However, in this same period, there has been a surge in the popularity of video games, especially ones with historical themes and settings, with 83% of children aged 15 to 18 engaging with video games. The strong popularity of video games suggests their success in offering an authentic and engaging historical experience. The history of experience is a brand new methodology that has been created to understand how individuals and groups meaningfully perceive reality and, crucially, their own role in it. The quote from Mona Gleason, a lead historian who opened the 2021 Hex conference, summarizes what the methodology aims to do: to understand how individuals and groups understood the past from their perspective. Our main tool in understanding the past through experience is by using the biocultural model of world, brain, body. The use of this tool allows a historian to link together world, which explores the varied and dynamic structures in which humans act, brain, which considers how individuals process this knowledge and interpret the world, and finally body, which examines how perceptions of the world are embodied, enacted, sensed, felt, and remembered. Rob Bottas, a lead historian in the history of experience, stated humans are shaped by their world, and this is the fundamental reasoning behind the methodology. By analysing how individuals and groups were shaped by the world in the past, we as historians can better understand the holistic perception of experience. The event that I chose to focus on and use this methodology around is the DDay Landings of June 6, 1944. The landings were a pivotal moment in history, with it arguably being the turning point towards the Second World War, with it also being the largest seaborne invasion in world history. Most historiographical analysis of the landings comes from the US perspective at Omaha Beach. However, I decided to focus on the Canadian experience at Juno Beach. The reasoning behind this was due to two factors. The first being that Canada was the only colony of a great power to be given overall command of a beachhead, and the second, that the Canadians made it furthest inland during the assault on June 6th. By using the Hex methodology, we can better understand the experience of these soldiers at war, to fully understand their pain, loss, and sacrifice that morning of June 6th. So with all this, I constructed a question that formed the basis of my proposed study. To what extent can student engagement in understanding historical experience of war in this case be enhanced through a holistic sensory approach offered by integrating Hex and war-themed video games? The aim of creating a pedagogical tool would allow for the fostering of learning and understanding of the Hex methodology. The website, which is being linked in the poster, can be used in both an online and face-to-face learning. The website was created for the New South Wales schooling syllabus, specifically for the topic of peace and conflict, a senior modern history subject. The structure of this website allows for the progression of the learning and building on the skills that will be introduced to students in this unit. This would involve many different lessons to be used throughout the unit of work. The progression would begin with the understanding of what the Hex methodology is, then understanding world, brain, body, and using it and analysing and understanding sources, learning about the D-Day landings, and finally, using Call of Duty World War II to holistically and critically understand the experience of the Canadian soldiers at D-Day. The penultimate lesson will require students to engage their full understanding of the history of experience. Students will be playing the video game Call of Duty World War II, specifically the first mission in the campaign titled D-Day. Prior to this, students will read a primary source from Jacques Ramond, a Canadian veteran of the Regiment de la Chauderie, a French-Canadian unit who participated in the landings at D-Day. Students will need to break down this primary source through world, brain, body to understand how Jacques perceived D-Day. Some excerpts from this primary source can be seen on the poster. Students will first analyse his understanding of the world around him, which can be seen in the quote, "The thing I remember most was the deafening noise. Planes flying overhead, destroyers in the sea firing above us. It was hell, the noise, the tension." Then moving on to the emotions. We were trained to handle it, but you had to be there to know how dramatic and stressful it was. It took solid nerves. And finally, to the way his body was reacting. We were squeezed next to one another in the landing craft, but don't ask how we felt. No one was talking. We just wanted to get there. The connection between world, brain, body conveys how the body can physically indicate how the brain is perceiving an event and can convey the stress and emotions that give us the internal thoughts of the soldiers at D-Day. Having done this, students will, before even jumping into the game, understand the experience that Jacques had at D-Day. Students will then play the first mission. However, there will be some rules that they must adhere to for making it more realistic and gaining the best results. These can be seen on the poster as well. Firstly, students must complete the level on the hardest difficulty, which is called Veteran. Secondly, the heads-up display, which is what shows the player's health, ammunition, and objective, will be turned off. This will be to allow the student to be greatly immersed into the experience. Thirdly, the student will only heal once and that is it. They cannot heal indefinitely. And finally, once the student is to die, that is it. They must stop playing there. Students upon completion will then reflect on the experience they had and reanalyze the source from Jacques Ramond to answer the question, how did the Canadian soldiers experience the D-Day landings? The use of Call of Duty World War II will also allow for better immersion of students and to also engage them to have their own emotional and sensory connection to the experience of the soldiers at D-Day. As this is a proposed study, it is hoped that it will also greatly increase student engagement in the activity. As stated before, 83% of children aged 15 to 18 play video games. Using something familiar to them will allow them to hopefully engage greater and give critical thought to the question. The aim of this will allow for students to have a better understanding of the experience of war that soldiers had, but also a more holistic understanding of the past. To conclude today, I would first like to thank the ACUR for conducting this event, allowing myself to talk about a topic that I am very passionate on. I would also like to thank my colleagues who spoke before, Georgia, Stefanie, and Soriya. We all worked with each other to tackle this brand new methodology, helped each other on the way, and made sure that we could all have a laugh and smile about it. I couldn't think of anyone else I would rather have worked with this on. I would also like to thank Dr. Karen McKenzie from the University of Notre Dame, Australia. Karen very much sparked the intrigue and passion for this topic. She was there every step of the way, and the support that you gave me, but also Georgia, Stefanie, and Soriya, highlights how amazing you are as an academic and as a supporter of history. The need to engage students in the classroom in this modern age is becoming more important for teachers, but also for students. By integrating Hex and video games, I've attempted to convey this new methodology to a new audience that may provide a new outlook on the subject. It also provides a way to get future historians thinking critically about the past. For a subject that is as complex as the history of experience, I strongly believe that this proposed study will deliver a humanistic and engaging learning experience that will encourage a student's understanding of the topic and have a greater appreciation of the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. That was really interesting. So we can open up our Q&A for our judges and our attendees. Any questions for Callum? Julian?
Yep, sorry. Hi. Yeah, thanks, Callum. That was really great. That was really interesting. I guess just the first thing I was wondering that came into my mind when I heard about video games, about war, was sort of like the connection of that to not encouraging, but, you know, that celebration of violence and kind of how you would tackle that or feel about that in regards to teaching students about the realities of war.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it did come up when I was thinking about, well, how do I use something like a video game that really does, I would argue, kind of glorify the violence? By using the quote from Jacques Raymond, talking about his own experience, the emotions, the tension, the amount of loss that we see throughout the entire primary source, it will allow the students to really empathize with, well, the reality that that many of these soldiers face, the loss, the horrors that they saw, instead of seeing it as a glorification that we normally see with the American side of D-Day, which is it was this grand heroic mission to liberate Europe. And when we look at it through Jacques Raymond's experience, we can see the emotional and humanistic side of war, and allow the students to try and connect with that on an emotional and also a sensory level. And that's what I'll be using the video game of Call of Duty to try and propose to try and get them to understand that.
Yeah, great. That sounds really good. Yeah, I'm sure you would have thought of that. It was just, yeah, couldn't fit it in with the presentation, but yeah, that sounds really good. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie.
Callum, there's a question for you from the audience. Do you know of any other historical video games that could be effective in the same way? Or is Call of Duty specifically equipped to address the emotions and sensory experience that you try to capture?
I think there's a plethora of different types of video games out there that can engage and allow for the emotions and the sensory experience of the history of experience. I really chose Call of Duty firstly for its popularity, that it's looking at it from the sense that, well, a lot of students would know or have heard of Call of Duty, and trying to engage them through that sense of something that they might interact with on a daily basis. And I used Call of Duty to try and, as a first person type of game, the player experience looks at the events that are happening around it through that first person view. So it allowed me to have a greater understanding and try and implement that idea of the emotions and the senses into the game from the primary source that we would look at as a collective of Jacques Raymond. So hopefully that answers your question there.
Thanks. Any more questions for Callum before we conclude today's session? Yeah, I think that's all. Thanks, Callum. So that brings us to the end of today's Historiography Visualized session. I'd like to thank our judges, Sally and Jillian, and our 4 presenters for such an interesting session. The recording of this session will be available, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.